So I've been working with React and RxJS a lot in the last year, and I really love the kind of functional component-based architecture of React and being able to do kind of composition with components to build up complex apps with it. However, I kind of missed being able to do reactive programming with it necessarily. So for example, when you're building a component that has a lot of logic internally related to state, maybe that even interfaces with props coming in externally, you end up creating class-based components like this clock, where you keep track of, you use kind of the lifecycle methods like a constructor to set up an initial state here. In this case, it's kind of a timestamp. And then when the component mounts, you set up some interval to increment that timestamp by calling set state somewhere else. And then you kind of clean that up on an unmount, and then you have render where that whole thing is consumed. So I've been curious about, how can we use RxJS or reactive programming concepts to model that logic while still leveraging React, its JSX, its ecosystem, and kind of its compositional abilities. So it turns out that can be done pretty easily with a library called Recompose. So Recompose is a functional utility library for React that has a bunch of functions that help you just do some more compositional or functional things with it. And one set of tools it has that I find really useful are these observable utilities. So the observable utilities allow you to model the logic of a React component using observables. And so you can kind of replace the idea of like state, setting state, and lifecycle events like should component update, etc. You can kind of get rid of all of that and model it fairly succinctly with RxJS and just output a component at the other end. So I want to show you how to just quickly take this clock component and refactor it that way. We're going to use a function from Recompose called component from stream. So what component from stream does is it creates a React component that you can put properties into just like any other component. What it's going to do is it's actually going to, when you create that component from stream, you give it a function that tells it how to take an observable of the properties coming in. So that's as the component's being re-rendered, it's going to fire properties through this observable. And you somehow map that to return back to an observable of a React node that should be rendered out into your DOM. And that's pretty much it. So I'll show how to build a component with that. So let's look first. I have this kind of stack blitz set up, and I have a little clock here. And the clock doesn't really do anything yet. And I just have React imported. So what I'm going to do is get RxJS and get Recompose imported in here. We're going to be using RxJS 6. And I'm going to go ahead and start importing that function I mentioned, component from stream, from Recompose. Now, Recompose is not opinionated about which observable library you use, because we don't have kind of ES observables as a standard in browsers yet. So you actually have to configure it to use a certain library, whether it's RxJS or Xstream or Most or Bacon or whatever other kind of observable library you're using. So instead of component from stream, we're going to import component from stream with config, and that'll allow us to kind of create component from stream with a specific observable library. In this case, we're going to use RxJS. So to do that, we need to tell it how to kind of convert to and from our observables. The to is fairly easy. We can just return an identity function. And the from is also easy because RxJS has this from function that will turn subscribables into observables of its own. So we can just say from, and that'll handle that part of it. Cool, so now we have a component from stream function that is configured for RxJS, so we can use it. So we're going to replace this whole guy with actually a component from stream. And to configure that, we need to give it a function in the inside that says, here are my props that I'm expecting to see in an observable. And at the end of the day, I need to return an observable of JSX. So for example, I might take the props observable and map that to something I'm going to render. I don't really have any props to render in this example, although we'll add that later. Let's just say the time is here. And I forgot to import map, so let's import that operator. So import map, and we get the time is, and that's it. I haven't really fed anything into it yet. Perfect. So now I can implement my kind of piece of state, if you will, for the interval. And that becomes fairly easy with RxJS because it has an interval function. So the interval function will just create an observable We'll call this our timestamp. The interval function just takes in a value in milliseconds and it will fire every few milliseconds from that. So I can just log this, like put a subscriber with a console.log here to see what that looks like. And you'll see it's giving me these integers out, and that's fine. I don't really care about the integer values. I just want these to be a date, so I can just pipe this and map those values, except I don't care about the values, to the latest date. So we'll do that, and now what you get is a date. There's another date, a second later, date a second later, so that's working. However, you may have noticed if I refresh this, there's a pause at the beginning, right? I need to kind of kick off with that initial date. That becomes easy enough with the start with operator. So I can just start with any value I want because I'm not going to really use the value below. I just wanted to kind of fire off that map to create a new date. So I'll just put start with there, and now we have a value that immediately kicks off there with the timestamp. Cool. Now I just need to take that timestamp and use it. So instead of using the props observable and mapping it to this thing, I'll use the timestamp observable, which is something I've just kind of created inside of this function. And this will give me the timestamp, the date, if you will, and I'll just say the time is, and we'll put timestamp dot to local date string. Is that what the function is? Let's see. Close. Is it local time string? There we go. And so now I see the time incrementing 1 second. So very simple, right? We replaced the this.setState and like kind of the constructor and the component did mount and component did unmount. We replaced all that with just this. This is the whole thing. What I'm going to show you is actually how easy that is to change. So maybe you want to build a component that merges props with that state. Like you want there to be kind of a like interval time or something the user can feed in. So maybe they want to initially feed in 1,000 seconds. So we want to use that property. Okay, so we can get that pretty easily, and we can also get it distinctly, which is cool. So a lot of times in React, you might, to try to like prevent re-renders from happening unnecessarily, you might try to use, should component update to double check whether like a property is actually changed or not before it, tries to re-render again. So we can do that here. We can get our interval time value off of our props by just saying, take the incoming props and map those props to props.intervalTime. And we can use an operator called distinct until change to say, only really fire this kind of interval time observable if this value actually changes. So let's get the distinct until changed operator here. And let's just get this working real quick by creating some state in our parent component here. So we'll create the state, which is interval time. Make that 1,000. Yeah. We'll map this to this.state.intervalTime. And then we'll add just like a kind of a dumb button that's kind of on click. It's going to increment the time. We're just going to make it do something, something simple. We're just going to add like a second to this thing. Increment time. We'll just say this.setState, and the interval time will become just increased by another second. Okay, so let's go back to the clock and just see like how this is working. So I have interval time $, and I'll subscribe to it. And you'll see that it gets that 1,000 value that I have as that initial state. And if I press this button, it becomes 2,000 and 3,000, etc., and 4,000. So it can get those updating props, but only really as they change. If I were to kind of call this again with 1,000, when the value was already 1,000, it wouldn't fire. So what's great about this is now I can manipulate this, and instead of saying, or modify this and say, instead of the interval being based on some static value, we're actually going to use this interval time. And every time we get a new time value, we are going to switch map with that new interval time to an interval of 1,000, sorry, not 1,000, of the interval time, right? It's dynamic now. And even in here, I can do kind of that initial, like, hey, go ahead and kick off with the new date. Start with null, and then we'll just leave them the kind of prop mapping it to a date on the outside. That's fine. And we're missing something here. That closes that, which closes that, which closes that. Yep, okay. So now, oh, of course, got to import the switch map. Okay, so now I've got kind of this user-defined 1 second gap, and if I click increment time, now it's going to be a 2 second gap. So there's 2 seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds, and if I click it again, now we're going to get 3 seconds of a gap. Now because I put the start width on the inside, it causes the clock to kind of reset immediately. You could put it on the outside if you wanted to kind of wait for only kind of restarting the clock when someone actually clicks it. Like you could do something like this, and now you're going to get slightly different behavior. As you can see, now you have like a lot of like very quick and easy, oops, put a comma here, control over how the kind of component works, even from kind of the outside merging kind of state and props together. Now we have it at 4 seconds going. So pretty cool. All that logic's encapsulated here. You can see that kind of going from that refactor of just having kind of just like a piece of state of time that's being kept to then having a property coming in that manipulates how that timer should behave internally. It's pretty trivial if you kind of know your RxJS and you kind of got this component built here. And to React users, it's going to look exactly the same. They're just going to consume your component in the same way. So that's a real simple example of kind of using RxJS to build out a kind of React component, but still using observables to kind of model the logic inside of that component. In future videos, I'll show some more complicated examples where we do things like adding UI interactions. So Recompose also comes with some helpful functions to allow you to capture user events like clicks and feed them back into the logic where you can merge them with your existing data, and that's going to be really helpful for doing things like triggering asynchronous data loading and other kind of side effects. So check out those videos when they come out later.